The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went, hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, who sent him to his field to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? Here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set up and went to his father. While he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and am no longer worthy to be called your son.' The father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and the sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' They began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never even given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. When this son of yours came back and was devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours.' But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
O Adonai, Holy Trinity, in your omnipotence we find courage, in your omniscience we find wisdom, in your omnipresence we will never be alone. Amen. You may be seated. This son of mine was dead, but now is alive. As we continue with this instructed Eucharist, and this instructed Eucharist that we're doing only for Lent, the Gospel is the time when the deacon, whose job is to pull the world into the church and to pull us, church members, into the world, is the time when we realize what we are here for. What are we doing? What is this? What has been established in Christianity? And it is nothing more than the Gospel, that there is good news to be preached. You have been sent with news to give the world. That the God that we worship is like the Father in this passage. And that's both complicated in many ways, but it is good news nonetheless. So week in and week out, when Mimi reads the Gospel and prepares you to hear it, she is preparing you to hear news that should be good for you. News that you should rejoice when you hear it. news that you should bring to those people in the world who need to hear it, which is you, me, and everyone else. And today's gospel is a perfect place for that, because more often than not, when we think of good news, when we think of love, when we think of redemption, we think of the parable of the prodigal son. So my hope is that as you think about this passage and as we begin to parse through it, we begin to look at the ways in which this has been interpreted. And so we will look at the interpretation that they had in the first century when they looked at this passage. We're going to look at the strange changes that have happened now when we look at it with 21st century eyes. And finally, we will come and look at the God that is seen in this Father, the God that we have that is shown in the Father of these two children. These two brothers. If you would have been in the first century and Jesus would have given this parable to you, he would have challenged you and reminded you of the great grace that God had for the world. The challenge of the elder son would have convicted you of all the ways in which you stood aloof and were frustrated that these tax collectors and these sinners were allowed into Jesus' sight, and the ways in which you were dead and had now come alive. You would have remembered the stories of Israel coming out of the wilderness and into the promised land, coming out and being emancipated from slavery under Pharaoh and going across the Red Sea and the dry land that God made for you. You would have remembered the manna in the wilderness. You would have remembered the time of the judges and the time of Samuel. You would have remembered David's confession and Saul's frustration and envy. You would have remembered Solomon's wisdom. And you would have remembered even the grace that God had for Nineveh when Jonah went there and preached to them, calling to them to prepare for God's wrath to come upon them. You would have remembered all the ways in which God had grace for the world, and you would have found that grace with the God who was there. And somehow, some way, the disciples then became a place where Levi, the tax collector, could become Matthew, the evangelist. The place where the fishermen could find their place alongside St. Paul and others. The place where all people might be able to find their way into this good news, because the good news was for them. This is the challenge that they had in the first century. And somehow, 2,000 years later, we switched it. We found ourselves, and if I probably took a poll, right, and had you guys raise your hands, I'm not. Who do you think you're more like? The prodigal son or the elder son who was left behind? I think most of us find ourselves with the elder son, right? Most of us are frustrated with God's grace, frustrated that God lets people in, frustrated with this magnanimous grace that has been poured out. We think of ourselves as the elder rather than as the younger. We don't really know what to do with it. And this passage becomes more and more complicated for us. And it's because we've forgotten. We've forgotten that we're the lost sheep that has been gone off and found ourselves astray. That we are the prodigal son, whether we like it or not. And we need that God to be with us. We need to be challenged by that God. Challenged by the way in which we have to come to ourselves in the midst of our own self-induced poverty, right? The way in which we have to come before that God, humble and broken of heart, and yet that God welcomes us. Welcomes us like we never left. Or more so, welcomes us into something even better than we had when we were there. Because if your kids ever came to you and said, hey, I want my inheritance now, rather than, later, the response that you need to give to them is, I'm not dead yet. That's the response. That's the appropriate response if your kids come to you wanting that inheritance now. I'm not dead yet. That's the struggle that they had, and that most people in the first century would have struggled with, and most people in the 21st century struggle with as well. Is this desire, and the fact that it doesn't make good good economic sense to give this kid money, and we should punish the kid when he comes back like the elder brother wants us to. Most of us, if we liken ourselves to the elder brother, think that we are enslaved in this world. He comes out of the fields, he cries about nothing that he's never gotten from his father. It's likely that it seems like he's never asked for it. And he didn't want to be like his son, his brother, like the prodigal son. He doesn't want to come in and challenge who he is by being like that, by being anywhere near his brother. He doesn't realize that we are all in need of grace. That grace doesn't give us a do-over like it happens for the prodigal, but is the path that we walk day in and day out. The journey that we have is a journey with a God who loves us. It isn't a journey to self-perfection. It isn't a journey to fixing our lives and making ourselves better than we were before. It isn't a journey to even self-fulfillment. It is a journey with God just as we are. If we can't bring our sin to God just as we can our righteousness, if we can't bring the need of love that we have just in the same that we bring all of the people that we love with us, we can't bring our whole selves to God, then this religion isn't really doing much for us. God has called you to recognize Him in the way in which this Father is recognized by both kids, by both of His children. Because they're both sinners. They both haven't figured out what God is like. They both have treated their dad as though it would be better if he wasn't alive. What's left for us is to continue the journey with the knowledge that we have. It's not to beat ourselves for Lent. It's to recognize that in Lent we are growing into the grace that God has given us. We are growing into the new life that will come to fruition on the other side of the resurrection. We are seeds being cracked open so that we can live into the full life that God has for us. That Lent means spring, and it is upon you. There's nothing you can do to get away from it. You have been planted into this world. You can accept your lot in it, or you can try and worry and want to be something other than you are. But God says, I love you just as you are. There's nothing you can do to escape from the love that I have for you. There's nothing you can do. The fact, if you ever were able to escape from that love, it would be like you falling off the earth. It doesn't make any sense. So God says, come to me now, just as you are. Come to the Father that has longed to see you this whole time. Stop pretending you're something you're not. Stop pretending I'm something I'm not. Come just as you are to God, just as God is.